Hello everyone, today we talk about late antique society and more specifically of the continuity from Roman to early medieval times as far as the country and city life was concerned. I've already made videos such as, the Roman legacy in medieval guilds. We talked about late antiquity in general. The last video was just the other day, coincidentally, and we will surely keep looking at these aspects, especially of the continuity from Roman to medieval times, to which we have not really been habituated to commonly, and that instead helps a lot, not just to understand these periods, but in general the entire kind of pre-industrial mechanism as far as this, at least sedentary civilizations are concerned. Much of what we usually consider, in fact, as medieval, has a far longer history than the Middle Ages, not just before, but also afterward, right? So certain mechanisms really stay the same. We are looking at sedentary civilizations, agriculturally based, with their more important centers of government, at least in relative terms, in the cities, in the urban centers, right? This we will explain in part as it changes from Roman to medieval times slightly, but the substance remains much more of the same that, again, we have usually been brought to believe, and later too. Right, the Middle Ages doesn't stop, as we've seen, in a magic kind of moment of the Renaissance that who knows would fundamentally modified in the essence of political and social structures, if not consolidating the ancien regime as we knew it, and of course, expanding it to the point of actually making the world benefiting from this order as well. But still, say, the Middle Ages is a great part of what we have seen until the Industrial Revolution, right? And you can argue, given these premises, until the 20th century, which is the first time in history in which more people lived in the city than in the countryside, meaningfully enough, right? And we, generally speaking, describe this not just out of, as you know, of a technological issue, which was in many ways secondary, as always is technically, as it always is technically in history. Rather, with a modification also of the same mentality behind the political and social structure, meaning that what we can see before the Industrial Revolution is largely similar to what we can see in the past. Naturally, if you ask any historian of society, right, they will point out mostly the differences of this. But we often forget that we can do this very often more easily than not, exactly because the basics were fundamentally the same, and so we can even just highlight more easily some differences that are, however, relative. So much of what we see for Roman times or medieval times, first of all, is practically the same, but it's practically the same also with essentially the life of the most advanced world, even up to a couple, really, if not more, less actually, of hundreds of years ago. Right. And unfortunately, again, the most difficult thing to point out here is that we have been fed with this notion that we live in a moment of great progress. Right. There is no doubt that development, life quality have dramatically increased, and any person who complains just about the true old ways of before, right, without knowing what those actually were, and not necessarily that people were worse. As you know, I often discuss these things, but it's really what you can do with this modernity that fundamentally you do not understand, right? If these people from millennia ago had the means we have today, First of all, I think they would have quickly learned how to use them, at least in an individual way, right? Give a Roman legionnaire a heavy machine gun, and in a couple of weeks that they know how to master that, right? In terms of small unit tactics. Of course, making the entire world run is a completely different thing. But and for many other things, I don't know, you can't really make a medieval running a nuclear plant just having brought them back from the past all of a sudden. But I mean that given what we have in terms of sheer amount of power, right? These people would have univocally said, "Why are you so lazy? Like you live in one of the most disgustingly rich, spoiled, lazy, in fact, soft-ass kind of, incredibly weak moments in history. And you have all this power, and you're basically doing nothing about that." Naturally, you can argue that most of these people, even if implanted here, would have, at least over time, blended in, right, and become lazy and fat and dumb and whatever, just like today. But the question is, let's focus on why, of course, that word functioned that way, but also let's be aware of the fact that this was just a very few time ago, and that yet we have absorbed some mental structures that are completely rigged, right, in terms of ideologism, just because, again, we can't afford to survive parasitically without any effort, as the overwhelming majority of people on Earth do every day, even though they complain about the fact of not having money or having such dramatic issues or whatever. It's all overwhelmingly a pile of garbage, naturally, but we self-convinced ourselves that this is the case, right? So looking at the past is not just very humbling per se and motivating and kind of inspiring, but it's also a way to properly fix the mental problems that we have, having convinced ourselves again of the fact that life should be just rights without duties, and basically just being maintained by someone that you don't even know what it is, and never saying thanks when this happens, by the way, right? If you're a rich person and you pay higher taxes in relative terms than the others, I would like to ask you, when was the last time that a poor person ever said thanks for that, right? Give it as a must, right? You simply have to do that just because, right? Even if you're a completely worthless person, of course, most people are independently from their wealth, but evidently the balance is not in favor of actually those who have less, and this has always been true in the entire history of mankind, reason for which the people as the demos, let's say, has never governed in any community in mankind, right, ever. And of course, barking against democracy today is ridiculous, because democracy never existed. So in many ways, what most people that don't like, allegedly, in this sense, the Western achievements are actually self-sabotaging the system to come back hoping that the demos can ever rule. And thank God we are actually living in a moment in which the demos is going down further, and that's why they bark so hard. And the fault is exclusively theirs, right? Because nobody prevents any person from making it to the top in any circumstance, right? And when you study especially past history, this is even more evident, because, again, people at the time at least fought much more, right, for what they could have, also because they were living in much worse straits than today, and yet things still crumbled, in spite of the fact that societal and political structures were much more traditionally solid, right? The moral consensus in the face of the sheer misery of those times' lives was the same kind of logical motivator for maintaining the communities more cohesive in all these wars. And I say this because, first of all, we will see how, hardly much ever changed throughout this time. We talk about late antiquity, depending on when you want to make it start. I don't know, the end of the 2nd century, the 3rd century, the 4th century, the 6th century, the 5th, I don't know, whatever. It's just a matter of, pure arbitrary decision. It doesn't mean anything per se. But we're looking at a world that naturally modified itself very gradually, right? Certain, say, if we look at the absolute essences, naturally in relative terms, some changes were very sudden, right? And clamorously so, civilizationally speaking, because we are looking at what a Marxist would call a superstructure, right? So a sort of, in fact, mostly the establishment as such, right? The rulers and those who are able to, in fact, in a sense, shepherd the rest of the population, civilization. And as far as that, naturally, these systems were much more fragile than our own. Why? Because they had a ridiculous surplus. The crop rate was dramatic, right? Today we live in an obscenely escalatorily exponential amount of surplus that these people couldn't even dream to imagine as a reality, right? And also moral surplus, because the degree to which you were exposed to premature death, uncertainty, violence, much more, was of course much higher than today on average. Again, things may easily go worse. We're talking here about, if not a civilizational collapse, at least a dramatic civilizational shrinking that took also a very long time to actually occur, again, in the sense that resources were gradually burned, of course, but you have hardly at the time any concrete realization, say, of the changes per se. I mean, it's been estimated that during the Middle Ages, it's a very kind of vague number, but as a measure is somehow reliable, that at the end of a work on the fields, a peasant would have had just a 4% surplus than one he had when he was born, right? That is to say, something you can't even see, de facto, right? Considering all the things that happened, wars, pestilence, etc., all what may happen in your life in terms of your affections, of your social connections, whatever. Of course, this was irrelevant in many ways. So at the time, there was a similar feeling. Naturally, we have different sources, different documentation from later, or even, partly previous times, so that we see culture always changing, right? There is never like a comparable reality in an absolute sense. 14th century Europe reacted to the plague in a way that at least left different evidence for us to study compared to, say, Justinian's plague, after Justinian's plague. And this is, of course, the great effort that we should always make as historians, because, yes, we can know a lot about the past, but this doesn't mean that our interpretation of it is, not just correct, but not necessarily the method and the standards that we employ, the criteria, are correct. So the outcome there is even properly a matter of debate on the base of these tools rather than even just the evidence per se. And late antiquity in this regard has been one of the single most researched fields, especially in the last decades, because of mostly ideological natures of how our kind of culture came to look at those periods. And of course, there's been, fortunately, also a bit of a reaction effect. That is to say, let's stick to the essentials of it to realize, first of all, what we're talking about. We want to have a clear interpretation, because there is not even just, of course, a socio-economical interpretation. It was somehow ruling in the previous generations, and that has somehow twisted also many interpretations, especially of politics, of mindset, of culture proper at the time. Right, and when we look especially at the concept of the fall of the Roman Empire, or at least of the evaporation of the western half, as you know, I've made lots of videos about that, and I have a very specific opinion of what happened. in there. That is of course out there historiographically, but it's not somehow as firm as I usually interpret it. But to me, things are relatively clear, right? You can, of course, debate on all these topics, but at least as far as what we see this political change, we have to assess, in fact, that the societal change was very gradual, and we cannot, in fact, divide sharply Roman times or medieval times. It's a mistake. It doesn't help anyone. In many ways, first of all, from an ideological point of view, because the entire notion that the Roman Empire fell is wrong, not just because there was what people still call Eastern Roman Empire. Of course, never had that name because it was just the same Roman Empire. Yet, properly because of what happened in the West and how the empire was seen, how humanity was seen, and how even other cultures that grafted on it and even changed it in a national sense were thinking about that. The empire was still there. These people were sure of being part of the empire, and the mechanisms that had been triggered again in Roman times that were there since very long, right? Even Republican times, or even before, because again, not even the Republic ever existed. Rome was always an oligarchic system, eventually evolving in a monarchic one, but still based essentially on a feudal principle that was the same one over which the empire was built. Right? There was a dominating people chosen by God, and all the rest of the world came down kind of organically within this hierarchy. And the same concept was there throughout all this period, and again until 1918, fundamentally at the latest. And there was really no other way to interpret the world. And you can argue that not even today you can see things very differently from that if you hadn't been, again, fixated with this thing. And I say this mostly because great part of the reasons why we have those mental deficits is because we need psychologically to draw that division between the Romanic, let's say the Roman Empire, and the Middle Ages, right? Because on that delusion rests great part of what the world believes after having rejected tradition a couple of 100 years ago, right? And people must believe that, because otherwise they would feel like the earth falling under their feet. Things naturally were, in a sense, also simpler to understand, right? Just because, in many ways, the world at the time was simpler, and sometimes when you realize how the audience, the world, generally speaking, approaches these topics, they tend to make words like, I don't know, ancient history much more complicated than even the present, right? They say, oh, the present is easy to understand. I live in it. I know it all, whatever. Never mind that it's a dramatically more complex and much bigger and, in fact, complicated world to understand. Nobody has ever studied comprehensively, and arguably nobody will ever be able to do so. No, you have to be building a major kind of weird, incoherent, illogical, contradictory construction about what happened, I don't know, from the end of the fall of the Roman Empire, this thing changed everything, then, the Middle Ages that are another thing. This is wrong, because the people that, of course, have lived at the time, who expressed the highest traditional values in that time, didn't say, not just like 1/10 of that, they didn't say anything of that. Or if anything, they said something that was diametrically opposite to this concept. And you must understand why, if you want, because the idea is that there is no worse stupid that he doesn't want to understand, which is exactly what happens in most of these situations. Now, just an example. There are many ways in which we could say, for example, that Roman culture was urban, while the medieval culture was rural. This is a big mistake, right? First of all, the majority of the people was always living in the countryside since ever, right? So the centrality of Roman cities within the empire that naturally was of huge significance as far as that kind of superstructural dimension was concerned, the way the empire was ruled, right? But in this sense, when an empire dissolves and or shrinks dramatically, it's obvious that that aspect, that net of communities, right, that shrinks as well, will look less impressive than it had been before. So people just mentally speaking go as far as saying, yes, the Roman Empire was urban, the Middle Ages were rural. What the hell does it even mean? Right, that there weren't cities, or these in the Middle Ages, or these weren't the centers of government usually, and or that, I don't know, there is a rural dimension of the Middle Ages that in the Roman Empire that properly did not exist as such. And the city did what the countryside did. Nobody really understands this cliches, right? You can't go as far as saying, yes, that the Roman urban culture was impressive, but why wouldn't be the medieval one the same? Actually, medieval cities were often more crowded, and in this sense, that even there were instances of the most urbanized areas of the Middle Ages that had as many population living in the city as in the countryside, the one in the countryside, which is something that in antiquity as a whole you never find, right? You have enormous concentration of people, sometimes the same imperial capital said to have reached 1 million inhabitants. There is wild debate actually still going on regarding those figures, because again, we don't know a great much in general. We understand, of course, that the Roman Empire was a big civilization that at a certain point shrank, contracted, and we still tend again to see the outcome of this as the end of, in fact, antiquity as a whole and the beginning of something else, right? We cannot deny that there was a change occurring exactly, broadly speaking, in this late antique, whatever it means, period. But, for example, we don't think the same thing about the Middle Ages. At least, we realize that the Renaissance, as much as the modern era, is the product of medieval civilization. It's not actually a development of medieval civilization, not kind of something for which the Middle Ages crashed dramatically and another civilization rose again, which is instead what we usually think happened between the Roman and the medieval one. Right? This is just even dialectically to frame the thing in a bit more, to make you more aware of how ideological sometimes our ways of seeing that this whole thing is. Right? Naturally, the Roman Empire was not homogeneous. As such, great part of what we think of late antiquity survived even far beyond. There are some historiographers that says that late antiquity didn't die in some places until the 8th century, the 9th century, the 10th century. And even in that sense, even if there may be something right there, the problem is always, what the hell is antiquity, right? What you would even think it existed, right? So dimensionally speaking, it is true, especially the Mediterranean maintained, of course, for the entire medieval millennium, actually a greater level of civilizational advancement. But generally speaking, we also have to appreciate the change for what it was, which again is as I understand, given what we just said, it's a subtler exercise than we're habituated to do, with all the idea of the crumble of the empire, the crash, the disaster, whatever. There were many disasters happening, but let's say they weren't altogether so decisive even to cause certain changes, that mostly were the adaptation still of the same communities that began to live in different ways, and for those reasons in part, but most of these disasters were actually caused by people. And rather than disasters, were also some sort of adjustments, right? Due to strength ratios and other kind of relations that we'll see also better in more politically based videos than the social one instead. it's obvious that any form of urbanism depended on farming, right? You couldn't have the city is born historically as any center, because of the accumulation of the surrounding land surplus. That's what you do. You have surplus. You realize that just a bunch of scattered kind of anarchic peasants alone are the easiest prey for any more politically compact community that can, in fact, would take them over. So what these communities do, they understand they have to centralize, they have to put some resources in common for an institution that is able, first of all, to defend them, because that's the first civilizational duty, right, of any state, of any community in the first place. And these resources must be protected themselves in a way or another. So you start walling them, you start fortifying the place, you start bringing in more people just to live there. You must bring more water, more food, and the community that lives there because there is somebody that is the same community in practice that has land possessions and that is able to project its own power beyond that. And so civilizations really start, right? So the farms provided in Roman times the essentially government's source of income, right? The commercial taxes of the cities provided only about 1/20 of the entire empire's tax income, right? The rest, this tells you that the magnitude of agricultural output in the fuel as the fuel of the empire came mostly from the land tax, the annona, right? So the annona essentially consisted in a farming, in fact, a tax on agricultural output that, as we will see, was also a bit more connected with the entire the community as such, right? The fact that this community was also increasingly tied to the land, was controlled by some lords and so on. And if you look at a farmer's perspective here, such tax could eat up 1/2 of his net production. That is to say, 1/4 to 1/3 of his gross one. This was, as you understand, a huge contribution, right? And it goes very close to what basically the norm really historically was regarding these agricultural systems, sedentary civilizations, because, as we've seen many times, these empires were constantly, coping with stability problems. There was a ridiculously coercive capacity, right? The entire, from the side of the state, the entire support to it depended on the people, as always, like in any system, but here even more, and that's why I was stressing before the necessity of political compaction to even be empires in the first place, because these taxes had served to create an empire that had conquered the world, and that could, in fact, afford essentially living on this output and consumption balance, providing with that stability that objectively the empire had provided for centuries and centuries, in the face of a surrounding world that was constantly unstable, underdeveloped, violent, and dramatically so, by the way, compared even to the pretty harsh life of the majority of the imperial subjects that were fundamentally peasants, right? Naturally, the taxes as such were cited by the farmers' rents, as well. We will see it now. We are in a time in which the degree of privatization and the gradual decline of the state increases. So it's as if the local landlords began to, in fact, be rulers on their own. And this is literally, the great collapse of the Roman Empire essentially consisted in this, right? Consisted in an end in the political covenant that was believed at that point to have been unsatisfactory, right? At least in terms of moral effort to keep the thing together. As we've seen, the most intensely Romanized areas of the empire were the western ones, which were the ones that decided to essentially bail out the earliest from, in a sense, from the same run. I mean, we've seen the same church with the same aristocracy. There was a general tendency towards a regional autonomization for essentially escaping what the late antique Roman state had gradually been transforming itself into. That is to say, an ever more, in fact, bureaucratic system that had fundamentally imposed the communities to be ever more tied to the land, for this kind of central administrators that were to collect the annona and other important resources. We'll see how the annona would gradually become something else, because again, there wasn't even the capacity, even Diocletian or Constantinian times, to actually pretend that every part of the empire would simply obey the center. This had never happened. It was impossible. No civilization had ever attained that, right? The Roman Empire had been working as, again, any polity on the base of consensus, and very large consensus, so much so actually that the same reforms of the late 3rd of the early 4th century, as harsh as they were, basically opened to a new phase of significant imperial stability, where nobody properly even thought or believed or thought it necessary to to gradually escape from this system, right? So there are naturally many reasons why the thing happened, and again, they are much less dramatic in political concept, right? Many people literally believed that at some point there was an anti-imperial ideology kicking in, right? As if today's populists and fourth essayists began, to destroy the system, which of course is still standing and will keep standing, because I don't know, they feel that there is some terrible, evil old guy behind the curtains that is conspiratorially doing who knows what with the world. The actual reality of any civilization is at some point people ran out of resources, right? As first of all, morally, right? I think always starts from the mindset. It doesn't start from the fact that people become poor, or that literally states cannot levy as many resources as they are needed to counter some other threat. It starts happening from the fact that people either give up, basically the struggle, because they think that they are too weak, right? Even though they are not. And secondly, because they practically prefer to self-sabotage the system than making a personal effort to make things work better. The latter can occur as much as the creation of some kind of smaller based systems is concerned, but I think that it's pretty much self-evident that after the Roman Empire, that political fragmentation didn't bring actually to a great deal of actual stability, if not for the fact that resources had ran out, so that in great part you couldn't have the same kinetic energy to be spent in wars and other things we will see now. But this doesn't mean the degree of stability in relative terms had gone up at all, right? Actually, it's quite the contrary is true. Basically, great parts of this world began to be ruled by leaders that had some kind of local support, but that fundamentally were constantly struggling against one another. Political fragmentation became a hallmark, like of the early medieval world, and especially the one that had, in fact, in Roman times, been less developed, less Romanized, less urbanized, less properly connected, and whatever, which would take, again, a good millennium before coping, with filling the gap, right, closing the gap with the still what was functioning definitely better and more stably. In perspective, you can argue that that's the point of, the Byzantine Empire in many ways. It's the fact that still when the West reemerged in high medieval times, this obviously took immediately the form of states that are basically the same ones in which we live now. We haven't been able to achieve a unity, but obviously the future, as long as power increases, is always that one, right? The entire point would be to live in a universal empire that is able to maintain a true order all over, and that, again, cannot be done if you don't have the decisive moral support of the population, per se. So this comes together with all the, let's say, a moral crisis. The other day we were talking about it more from a religious perspective. We've seen how the role of the church fundamentally was crucial here in maintaining de facto the spiritual unity of the West. Again, the Western Roman Empire, as an administrative partition of the empire, waned, right? The powers that formed out of it essentially for a while kept working on the same Roman base, and then this thing contracted again because there were further wars, for further, there was the Justinian plague that was definitely a heavy blow, and so after this, you have definitely that political fragmentation that Europe would never recover from. Like, you had essentially the Carolingian Empire. Historically, you had, Napoleon or the Nazis, but as you understand, these were ever more short living experiences that left space to something much bulkier, that was the state. Again, it's difficult not to see in the early medieval Romano-Germanic kingdoms de facto, right, most of modern national identities nowadays in Western Europe, and the base, meaningful enough, was Roman, right? At least the before Central or even more Eastern Europe had something similar, like functional kingdoms based on a national identity, at least in the Latin etymological sense of it. Like, another half of a millennium would have happened, and even with histories actually of, as you could see in the modern age, etc., with much greater political fragmentation, so that a true unity would never be achieved again. So it is definitely a negative dynamic that, let's say, in many ways mirror the same developments of the empire. I mean, there is a quite rigid divide existing between the Roman-dominated world and the one that remained out of that. Right, generally speaking, northeastern Europe wasn't as advanced for a very long time, and in great part actually still isn't. Right, you can argue that at least the Scandinavian, the Nordic countries were gradually Francicized in the High Middle Ages, but even it took another half of a millennium before they stabilized as true kind of functional states. But even further east, you understand that it's a completely different story, and that much worse things happened, generally speaking. Just even the Iron Curtain in the 20th century, you can't argue it's not really the Roman imperial boundaries, but there are surely divides and dynamics and kind of even spiritual divides. In fact, think about the difference between the Catholic and the Orthodox world. But these are things you can't even see in modern countries. I don't know, the divide between Roman Germany and non-Roman Germany. The single most advanced areas in Germany are still today the areas where the Roman Empire had been working. Naturally, on the base of pre-existing kind of let's say, in that case also at the time, especially relevant environmental factors, not entirely, but, it's been said, not without much, mistake, that the frontiers of the Roman Empire were the ones of the vineyards, right? And it is true, right? It does have to do with climatic issues as well. So one of the most important civilizational indicators was the way this state, in part, also survived in the administrative structures later, right? You can easily see after the fall of the West the boundary between the literate areas and the illiterate areas. In many ways, they are the ones between, at that time, the Romance and the Germanic world. You have just Britain that gets more, essentially gets Germanized, right, truly to maintain, in fact, de facto Germanic language until today. But the greater powers, as far as the Visigoths, the Franks, the Ostrogoths, also the Longobards by a degree, because, by the end of the 7th century, they were objectively the largest, the most powerful polity out there, in spite of all the historiographical myths against it. You realize that existed because they existed on at least kind of sort of regional / provincial / statal base of some sort. They were also city-based, de facto, whereas the rest of of Europe was, at least the non-Roman Europe aside the Byzantine Empire, was still essentially tribal in nature, was fragmented, was unstable, had been subjected to greater depopulations, repopulations, and the local political and social structures naturally had suffered of that over time. This is why the gap also had still existed and maintained. Again, even the temperature, even the fact that Central, Northern, Eastern European regions are colder, have a huge deal of impact on a level of technological development like the one of the Iron Age, right? So these are hardcore, massive, microscopic kind of systemic factors that are literally the first anchor that you may want to use to define the developments between still what was de facto, if you don't want to say Roman, at least post-Roman reality versus one that had never known Roman rule, right? And there is no doubt that these eras were also the more advanced, and ones that later on would still bring in more output in general, right? So, needless to say, and especially in Gaul and in Spain, you have really a late antiquity that self-perpetuates itself without too much of a discontinuity. Right, Italy and Britain had more problems regarding this. This is not even to say that we're not talking about even the degree of Romanization per se, right? But the degree, at least, of political and social system, mostly the wealth distribution related to the late antique system, right? The latifundia remained in Spain, in Gaul, right? The latifundia basically do not remain in Britain. Even before the Anglo-Saxon migrations, this was essentially the engine of a system that happened quite obscurely, but brutally, apparently, during the same Romano-Brittonic period. And you don't have latifundia in Italy after the Gothic War. I just made a video the other day exactly about this topic, at least as far as the history of the city of Rome between the two Ostrogothic sieges and the Latin Germanic reaction to Byzantine fiscalism is concerned. Right, that is a very good example because it's literally in between, and it makes you see things a bit more comprehensively. So the annona, by the way, a little detail here was, as we just said here, mostly consisted mostly in nature, right? And it got down to the longer the system continued to just the right to exploit the local land resources, right? Initially was a contribution also in money, telling you the truth, still in nature, right? Remember that even at the peak of the empire, when we read about, I don't know, the Roman legionary salaries, all the stuff, we naturally see it substantiated in currency, but they were often already also in nature, right? And this depended on just even the lifestyle that these communities had, specifically the fact that they were provincially decentralized, that they had fundamentally a life already there, right? The entire deal of the limitane and the gradual absorption of those units, even the Romano-Germanic armies, is the obvious consequence of just the gradual stabilization, right, of the frontiers, but also in fact of the communities that lived there, right, and that were basically becoming all one with the army, right? If you look at the Rhine or the Danube frontier, you realize that the legions throughout all these first centuries of the Common Era stayed there basically all the time. They hardly ever moved. Even the campaigns in which they were used to aggregate in a very specific strategic theater, like it could be during the Dacian Wars or this kind of other, also the expeditions in these, that fundamentally remained always where they were, right? So this continuity, this lack of change, right, it should sit in much more like in the way we see what happened to the empire gradually, because these were de facto communities that from centuries were working always in the same way, and that they wouldn't have any actual reason to change, right? The invasions weren't a like a happy moment, right, for anyone, including the invaders, because technically they would have preferred to remain where they were in general if they hadn't been pushed by invaders, by hunger, by famine and beyond, and essentially having to win their own to open their own way through arms, to settle in basically at least at best a few 100,000 of people in amidst regional populations of multiple millions, right? That were to become one with the invaders, and vice versa. In any way, and so working from the same local places, from the palaces, with literature, with essentially with the same Roman language and administration, etc. And essentially marrying, essentially was an elite power share, and intermarriage. Right? That's what it got down to. For the humble farmer of these lands, things wouldn't change much at all, right? And in general, they changed for arguably the worse over time. At least from early imperial times, where still most people enjoyed greater liberty than the one they would have in late antiquity, and that was hardly regained in any other later period, de facto, right? Because not just because, as we've seen, the latifundia remained in many areas, but because even a greater increase in freedom that doesn't necessarily correspond to a greater increase in liberty, right? The romantic idea of the free man who lives out there in the countryside, builds his own house and cultivates his own, isn't at all even if it was devoid, less bound politically or socially, right? It was hardly a better life. And that during the Middle Ages, actually, there is never that form of liberation. The same Germanic peoples that settle in these lands fundamentally experience immediately in their population a loss in freedom, right? Their chieftains increased their power disproportionately to anything that would have been tolerable in Central Europe, and simply because they had more surplus and so more means to create clienteles and hierarchies and making the rest of the population obey. Because the rest of the population, after all, individually had more than what they had in the ancestral lands, they had, at least originally, had also a higher juridical status than the average civitate, let's say. But quite soon they simply fell to those standards themselves. And so in the early Middle Ages, you see, even before the, say, probably what we call feudalism, that was already there, by a degree kicked in, it displayed the characters of a much more privatized, seigneurial, and thus also kind of free, free society. Right, these individual lords could be freer, but the people living under them hardly were. Than, say, the time, I don't know, a Roman citizen back in the late Republic or the early Empire was provided with some farms in a military colony out there, and still could afford an important degree of autonomy there. Right, naturally there was a large enslaved population at the time, but let's say the loss in personal freedom experienced by the Roman colony in the late Empire was practically the equation to that. Not quite, because at least slavery in the moments of greater Roman expansion was much more brutal, right? But it still concerned, in fact, just a minority of the population, and still slaves were not were precious also for the greatest moments of prosperity of the empire. They wouldn't just slaughter them like flies, or making them like flies. Many latifundia looked like concentration camps, but don't think that out there in the world, like the average tribesman didn't treat the slaves like in the same way, because we actually have proof of this as well. But the general mindset there was quite pragmatic. You have to make things work and to be productive. And manumissions were out there for a reason, because they had essentially to emancipate this slaves and becoming serfs, some sort of clients that could also have more individual, say, personal autonomy to render the clienteles more competitive and such things. So we like to dramatize slavery that existed throughout all the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, but human resources were very precious, especially at this point, and this is also one of the reasons, we'll see now, why the empire had ever greater difficulty in exploiting them, because even the Roman and Romano-Germanic landlords had ever greater interest to maintain their own peasants in their own possessions, right, and not being sent in the army on some far frontier from which they would never come. It would have simply entailed a loss in manpower, in productivity, without mentioning the fact that these lands were also subject to civil wars, invasions, and so on. So the population was really a big problem, and that this also helped the settlement of the Germanic peoples in a cooperative way, because they would just be settled in areas that had gone depopulated. They were entrusted essentially the annona resources to provide actually with the army, because most of the expenses of the as we've seen from the peasant production to the annona to the empire went for the army largely, right? So by settling these other warlike populations from Central, Northern Europe, etc., the locals would have had fundamentally protectors that could, again, for a while at least, keep alive the same Roman military system, right? And the great contraction occurs by at least the end of the 6th century, right? You can beautifully see in a country like Gaul, that had not been brutally devastated more than other places, was one of the most intact ones, that the Merovingian armies passed from the time of Clovis at the beginning of the 6th century to basically same Roman armies, regional provincial armies of 30,000 men with you know, also semi-professional militias, Roman equipment, artillery, whatever, to basically hunting parties of a few hundreds men. They are basically saying Merovingians and their personal retinues that are fighting against each other at the end of the period, when the same the Frankish kingdom is de facto split in 4 chunks. So that gives you a good picture, a good indicator of how contracted the system became over time, right? Also before and after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So this is a broader trend. You can't speak of a broader, say systemic trend. You can think, people say, because the climate became colder. We know history shows pretty well that humans can fuck up the system by themselves without any climate change, even if it were caused by them, even in part, which we hardly even have the way to measure technically, in spite of the best efforts today. In any case, this situation, as you understand, is a critical one, is one of decline, one of contraction, whatever you want, of shrinking, whatever you want to call it. And it started from quite a long time, and it was much bigger than most of these this phenomena individually can explain, right? If not, again, a broader, it could get down to the second principle of thermodynamics, the idea that at least if you have a system to say if you have a specific mechanism to exploit a system and you rely on that for a long time, at this point, at least the resources that you can extrapolate through that system will run out, and you may not have the capacity to adapt before you basically start going red in terms of energies themselves. And so things will restart from other bases at another point, which is what happens essentially during the High Middle Ages, also very slowly, and actually not even at that point much because of some kind of broader qualitative improvement. I mean, the idea that in the the European economy recovered in the year 1000 because there were new tools, and rotation, crop rotation, all this stuff is wrong, right? The crop rates remained essentially the same. In some places they even went down even in the time of the expansion. So the dynamics are evidently not technological, are evidently not just economical. At least the economy is just a reflection of what happens at a political level, thus mostly at a moral level. So also at a social level as a consequence, right? But they are, in military one, of course, but they're all intertwined, right? Measuring things economically is just measuring the consequences of in a very specific, materialistic, to a materialistic indicator. Studying history, understanding politics, understanding the world is a completely different thing, right? That basically has nothing to do with economics, just not as an indicator of something, not as what makes the thing, right? It's just looking at the thing as it happened, not why it happened. So, in all this, consider, again, you have, as we just described, a state that consumes an enormous amount of resources. The same is true for, again, the peoples in Central Europe. Just think of how they went depopulated with the migrations. Why would those people migrate in the first place? There was some mechanism that was just making them at least prefer the Roman lands to their ancestral ones, and large parts of those remained depopulated so much that just the Slavs at the end of the major movements take their place again from the least developed areas of Europe. So you definitely understand that there is a moment of crisis, a crisis that causes a great movement because resources are running out for everybody involved. So there was a very delicate and fragile balance, as you understand, to maintain this enormous surplus that is manifested as the Roman Empire. So that any unbalancing event, for example, a bad crop year, war, drought, a harsh winter, or any factor which raised costs even slightly. Again, the crop rate was ridiculous, right? This would remain the same for the entire Middle Ages until the Industrial Revolution, right? So any minimal unbalancement, that's what today could say, I don't know, this maybe just a fresher spring, by the time, could equate to widespread misery as a consequence. And I would like to stress that even though, let's say, climate change is not necessarily, again, the main reason why things happen, having studied mostly medieval chronicles in my life, you realize that people were much more impressed by sometimes, a cold summer or a hot winter than other things like, maybe just somebody getting killed or whatever. So they were very they were very careful about that. Even the plague, right? If you think, I read the medieval chronicle for years and years, and then you arrive at the plague moment. Yes, that year there is, oh my god, so many people die, but it ends there, right? Then there are lots of other things going on, politically, militarily, environmentally, that they take note of, and that naturally at that given moment they didn't quite describe in a kind of era-changing way. Naturally, we can see from art, from other sources, how, of course, mentality changed, how certain views of the world were kind of preferred to others. You can see a general anxiety in the zeitgeist and more. This is evident also in late Roman time, if it weren't for the fact that at this point the system was also ruled by mostly landlords, so that we don't often have any much of a voice coming from the average person that was, again, a peasant working in the latifundia, right? They had other things to think about. The elites had fundamentally been controlling the system. So, as we'll see now, there is mostly another higher kind of cultural reorientation that we were talking about the other day regarding how to see the world, how to see the ultimate destiny of it, what can humans do about that, what is their connection with this outer world, right? But the crisis is there. In fact, tax evasion, we know, becoming a survival technique almost around this time. Consider that Diocletian had established pretty rigid measures for which, if you were born in a peasant family, you had to remain a peasant, and not only but to remain under that landlord on that land for all the rest of your life. Equally, if you were a soldier, if you were the soldier, your children were to be soldiers themselves. Naturally, there were lots of exceptions to this because, again, it was a much less controllable system than it seemed. But at least the effort of the Roman state to maintain a strict control, at least in supervision of the demographic and agricultural resources, was quite strong. It's Diocletian's capitatio and iugatio, right? So what they literally cared about was knowing that in a given district, given that the Roman Empire was redistrictuated at that point, had a given amount of people and agricultural resources to provide to the state in case of need, right? And this system was especially starting to fall apart by the 5th century. In the 5th century, again, at the beginning of it, there wasn't much of an expectation things were going wrong. After all, Theodosius had reunited the empire. Yes, it had been resplit into administrative halves, but it was still the same, right? At the end of the 2nd century, in less actually than, say, the 60 years, you have the Western half that doesn't exist anymore, right? And you understand there that basically nothing tremendous happened, right? After all, the West managed to push away Attila, managed to even to mount up. It had to abandon Britain. It had, of course, there were issues of that kind. They had the Federati to settle, to lose de facto control of many areas of Gaul or Spain. But say until the 60s of the 5th century, an emperor like Majoranus, with essentially the resources of the Italian peninsula, managed to crush the Visigoths in Spain. And if it hadn't been for the Vandals getting in the way, because they would have been next in Africa, it was also threatening the Italian grain supplies, from the same Africa. Again, at the beginning of the Islamic conquests, if those had even happened at that point, the Arabs would have found a Western Roman Empire, likely, if not in Africa, at least in Spain. That is to say, what happened in 476 and in the following years were basically the last, say, Roman successor states, or properly, even legitimate rulers like Nepos. We're talking about essentially Dalmatia, Northern Gaul, Morocco, etc., melted away. Nothing really traumatic happened. I mean, there weren't invasions at that point. There weren't major disasters. There weren't major epidemics, right? The thing simply stopped, right? They decided politically that it was unnecessary to keep having a Western Roman emperor, that the local communities could fundamentally work on their own. And in all this, largely, late antiquity was going on without any significant change. Again, the most dramatic events would be mostly the Justinian's reconquest and plague, right? And even there, as we will see now, late antiquity, even at that point, late antiquity survived in some dynamics, right? Even in the most struck countries. The fact of evading taxes, naturally, and the fact that it could be done, evidences the difficulties of the central government to replenish its resources through that original cooperation. The imperial coffers were constantly empty. This was a huge deal that also contributed, like in all moments of crisis, to, again, politically fragment, yes, but also to compact more on a local base. And you can argue that what happened in the East, right, around Constantinople, and still fundamentally what was the legacy of the Hellenic coastal urban world, is the foundation of what we know as the Byzantine civilization. Fundamentally, it was something substantially different from what the Romans had established. There was a major continental, contiguous territorial control, right? Aside from, of course, the greater amount of resources that could be drawn from the Mediterranean. But again, you have major land masses, especially in the West. There are also very, say, continuous, right? Not particularly composite, right? You have these major chunks. It's Italy, Gaul, Spain, and Britain, right? The East is more complex because the hinterland is less Hellenized than the coast. There is a very different profile than in the West. That is not to say that in the West there weren't areas that were more Romanized than others that weren't, right? There is an important boundary there too. In fact, generally speaking, it's the Mediterranean areas that maintain a more markedly, Roman and late antique, we can say, profile, right? However, Romanity did survive in important ways also, and more arguably in the West, that even in the East, that technically we say it was Romanized, of course, but again, it was already the seat of a civilization that Romans had ruled over and that had not succeeded in, for example, Romanizing linguistically, as opposed to what had happened, I don't know, in Gaul or in the Iberian Peninsula, right? So the West had a very strong interconnection that we don't have to be fooled about regarding the evaporation of the West just per se, and that especially again in the spiritual unity of the Church of Rome was to essentially consolidate very quickly, even among the newcomers, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. So the furthest from which you could have, you think, a contact with Rome, actually becoming arguably one of the greatest successes of evangelization and ecclesiastical administration and just political bonds, together with a Gallic Merovingian medium, with other important spiritual centers that existed in Italy, in Spain, also the monastic experiences that were taking place, especially in Gaul, in Italy, etc. Now, avoidance of the land tax, by the way, was of course hurting the government, but not helping the late Roman peasant. Right? That's what we were saying before. The state may seem oppressive by some degree, but without it, things do not really go much better at all. As when the government becomes less effective at collecting the taxes, also the landlords increase the rents. Right? You're going to free yourself of a state, and then what? Who's really going to rule? Think that you're simply going out there, nobody's taking over? Right? That's exactly what occurs, and basically, when you look at the senatorial families, some of which also de facto turning into the episcopal ones, especially in great centers like Gaul is the best example likely, but it was true in the entire late antique system. Things go naturally like before, if not worse, because there is technically nobody from the above that can even come and save you to maintain some kind of standard justice of some sort, because some communities there could be squeezed more than others. This did happen also under the imperial administration. However, the greater degree of control that existed with all kind of more the provinces essentially cooperating to a common goal still provided with a greater stability, and thus with the preconditions for not, say, requiring ever more contributions in that regard. So the system, again, decayed slowly, and for reasons that are still debated, at least in the broader system, because we know it happened, but we can't identify precisely the quantities of all the various factors, because there aren't sources to explain us concretely how it happened. At least the allegiance here starts maybe even maintained, because some communities still thought under, I don't know, the Germans that they were still part of the empire. After all, those conquerors had been settled as federati, had surely made it clear that once they had gotten that land, they could hardly be dislodged from there. But there was still, again, a universal understanding of imperial rule, for which basically any people in the empire had always been a thing on its own, technically, giving power to Rome for just safeguarding them and contributing to it, and having the opportunity of promoving themselves politically, socially, and entering the Roman Senate, etc. The degree by which the Roman landlords, later also mixed with the German ones, would take over the system was also gradual, right? Was also like bishops were becoming de facto already also warlords on their own, when the Germans arrived and these families married into each other, of course, there was a greater hybrid, right? The Germans got somehow more civilized, they converted to Christianity. The bishops from their side became more warlike and somehow like more lordly in habits, right? So again, I made many videos about the various differences in the differences in the various lands of the West regarding these mechanisms, but generally speaking, there is a common pattern you can assess by some degree. The collection of a tax on the one hand or of a rent on the other was one way in which you can see the continuity between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, right? Because both forms of collection existed in both periods, and the fact that before there was a stronger state, it was compensated later by the fact there was a kind of stronger lord, right? So in terms of how quantitatively you would have had to provide, in relative terms, was pretty much the same, right? Doesn't matter to whom you have to pay. Actually, it's better to pay to a greater lord for the same amount, right? And when you look at, naturally, it's difficult to measure these indicators as well, but when you look at the misery that existed both in late antiquity, like in early medieval times, in these worlds, which was the misery pretty much shared by the average, again, sedentary, civilized worldler at the time, what strikes you is just, the moral consequences of this were much greater than even just a few differences in material were concerned. Again, the greatest effort that we are not used to do because we want to romanticize the past, make it look more shiny and aesthetic and glorious and honorable and whatever, is realizing the sheer amount of misery, morally and materially, that existed in this world, right? The fundamentals traditionally were better, right? There was a more coherent idea of what properly universal power had to be, the importance of transcendence. However, this doesn't mean that everybody actually was up to those standards at the time as well, right? And this was arguably also the reason why they, because of these terrible deficitary existence, they looked more directly at those values as the most obvious solution. Whereas today, again, if you are fat and lazy, you're unlikely to even know what transcendence is supposed to be. So Rome had maintained her power and prestige and an empire, in fact, by essentially abiding these standards and manifesting that through her military might as well. So while it's true that large armies fighting distant wars with a very substantial also supply apparatus, etc., the empire would naturally pay for that, and there were important economical consequences. But when in late imperial times you had, for example, badly supplied armies that are just of some usurper, some federati leader, or whatever, that are just passing by, unopposed, right, or requisitioning resources, and or maybe even when they stabilized as a sort of lordly army, still, the effort in relative terms to fight against the neighbors that are, again, here unchecked by a superior power, requires resources. Well, you can't quite see the difference of it right? There is no doubt that, for example, in the Middle Ages, a great part of the population was militarized. That is to say, even in substantially developed times, like it could be, I don't know, the 14th century, you can look at France and say 40% of people are fundamentally just prone to at least know what war is, right? Having, if not participated properly in military operations, but having seen the disruptions, having had to arm themselves to defend their community, whatever. You realize not even the Prussia of Frederick II had such a high level of militarization. And great part of the Roman world had historically been unarmed, because normally the state pacifies also with these means. And actually, during late antiquity, there was re-militarization by some degree. Again, very in let's say, this formally peaceful figures, including bishops, were dramatically involved in the city defenses. Think about, the Hunnic invasions and how literally you have prelates supervising the construction of fortifications, the armaments, all these things, and just going at war themselves. So you have properly there the measure of how much the destabilization had brought to the need of defense increased, right? And shaping, in fact, all the agricultural system accordingly, the way the resources were stored, and more. There is a process of encastellation that is typical of late antiquity as well, right? That remains importantly throughout the early Middle Ages. We don't have a huge archaeological evidence because they were simpler structures, and somehow, materials like stone, etc., were very costly, so there are less traces, literally. But there were imposant, kind of mostly defensive systems that would correspond to what Luttwak would call the defense in depth of some sort, that were based on this interconnection between various communities that were essentially to trap the enemies in some kind of nets that were attacking, harassing their supply lines, while being for the rest fundamentally entrenched in their own city gates, right, in their own walls that at some point were crumbling because the state didn't have the resources to fix them, but that the sense were all stuffed with, I don't know, in fact, wooden structures and or the fortification of structures, the buildings inside the city, such as, I don't know, the Colosseum was, as you understand, a massive fortification, for example, throughout the entire Middle Ages, and used as such in the turbulences of aristocratic Rome. In theory, back in the day, the farmers were entitled to reimbursement in case of damage carried out, for example, by the same Roman armies, requisitions that naturally in times of war, of invasion, of emergency were legal in imperial law, but they would also rarely ever receive these resources. Again, the same army pay was a quite complicated thing to provide, especially with the contraction of monetary economy, and thus it was mostly in the form of settlement. Hence the federati, the hospitalitas, the exploitation of local peasants and lands, that the thing was compensated mostly. So that's how much of the seigneurial system was affirmed already at this point. You can argue that in the moment of major military operations, no one living along the great military roads was safe. Today we do not talk about, for example, the elites, their role in the government of the cities, etc., but you know that especially in very well connected countries like Gaul, with a great road system, very specific and kind of well distributed urban centers. If an army passes from one city to another along the main road, I mean, everybody that is, in its proximity is going to flee by a degree, right? This did contribute to depopulate the same cities, by the way. right, and to create also some higher degree of subsistence in the same villas that came to be fortified, to become even the base of further castles over time, right? The same is the concept of the monastery, of this fleeing from the world that was spreading as a broader kind of introspective existential journey, experience, attitude towards this lack of justice, this difficulty in accepting the crisis. It's hard to accept the crisis. Mostly there is a cognitive dissonance, sort of wishful thinking that things are not good. But at some point you're brought to desperation. You're brought to a moment in which you have to find within yourself the strength to cope with the reality. Naturally, communities per se do tend to stabilize. So as I was saying before, this all helped the affirmation of lordly power, right? It wasn't like the affirmation of even of the Germanic peoples, a moment of greater anarchy that it was before. Actually, late antique sources are pretty eloquent about this, right? While the Roman Empire was in trouble, you could have things like literally the emperor writing to Britain and saying, yeah, look, sorry, but we don't have enough troops to protect you. You're on your own, right? In part because the same Britons had lost faith in the capacity of the empire at least to protect them from a degree of raids. So what local communities naturally wanted was mostly to protect themselves. So when you read about, the Franks or the Longobards or whatever, you have sources even in the early 7th century, some of the most obscure times, as far as it come up like as anonymous writers just saying randomly things like, thank God that these people arrived, because now this country now has a greater stability, has a greater order, has a greater authority, right? Has a greater discipline. It wasn't easy because within the same Germanic peoples, right, before teaching the aristocracy to behave in a civilized way, really a long time had to pass. Like if you read Gregory of Tours, well, he's quite eloquent about that, as we were saying before in the case of the Merovingians, that actually their own same kingdom would fragment in turn throughout this crisis. So in that sense, there were better and worse times depending on the situation. Naturally, there were also much kind of more, let's say, frontier areas by a degree, so gray areas that were just the local lords would autonomize themselves, and there wasn't even too much of an authority increased, right? But mostly where the Romans had ruled from was used as a base to perpetuate a similar degree of power around the palaces, around at least some areas, again, especially in the north, mostly concentrated power in rural households, etc. But the role of cities, right, remained always cardinal, in a sense, even for itinerating courts. So when you look at the legal status of the peasantry in late antiquity, you realize that de facto the coloni were the same as medieval serfs, right? There is no other way to put that. It's not slavery, but it's essentially a tied condition you can't quite free yourself from. In the late empire, the most productive agricultural land formed part of huge estates, right? Still, right? As long as the latifundium existed, great landowners owned really a disproportion. Like we're talking about regional scale of agricultural assets, right? The greatest of whom, by far, by the way, was the imperial one. So a sort of emperor's private asset that had been, still was technically the public domain, right? We have seen this also evolving further in Byzantine history with entire provinces being de facto a huge imperial house, right, farm or something like that. And the majority of farmers were tenants, as we've seen, so they weren't free land owners, right? They used the owner's land in return for rent. They essentially had to provide, as we've seen, a part of their product plus labor service or some combination thereof, which is incredibly similar, if not identical, to the seigneurial system. The corvée were already there from as early as, I don't know, the Roman Republic, by a degree. Right, again, the degree by which this happened naturally was much less at the time than in late antiquity. But of course, the idea that you are a landowner, you have clients and slaves, whatever, you can't oblige people to work for you because just they are disposed to do it because they're in dire straits and they are going to just to care about your own protection because it's very convenient to them. Well, it's the same of medieval times. I mean, it's just actually going to reinforce itself, as you know, and remaining the norm up to a few hundred years ago. Naturally, there are different obligations and requirements, at least in form, that distinguish late antiquity from the early Middle Ages by some degree, right? But the half-free status of most peasants changed very little from the days of the late Roman Empire, right? And every country has its own history, right? Generally speaking, what may seem paradoxical is that the lands of the Mediterranean will juridically emancipate themselves earlier in the Middle Ages. I made a video about this in the 8th century, right, where you have a switch from serfs and massari, for example, in the Lombard countryside, right? In countries like, I don't know, Germany or France, actually you have the other way around, right? You would think that was a greater freedom, right? And this would be maintained traditionally, whatever. No, basically, by that same point, the freeman becomes somebody's person, right? They become serfs, and they're going to remain that historically, even in the communal forms, in the social mechanism, the political identity, and this obviously has to do with the degree of statal power. Again, in the Roman Empire, you had technically still a Roman citizen that, again, we don't have to romanticize excessively because, as always, like up to very few hundred years ago, people did have rights, but only the rich de facto could afford to be defended juridically and so on, to go in a court, because again, putting yourself against somebody who was more powerful than you could easily bring to your demise anyway, right? Because all these systems were, as we were saying before, corrupt. It's not until, again, the power of the contemporary state that you have, again, a new capacity to enforce kind of standard rights, right? The empire had gone close to that, especially in early imperial times, at least closer, of course, than what would be in not just in late antiquity, but then it was, say, in where the state did not exist. Tribesmen, in that regard, had always had an aristocracy, had always had, again, somebody who was more powerful than others, and that basically became their clients and would be controlled by them. So that the idea of freedom that we have, for example, during the migration here among the barbarians, was actually hardly any of that. It was the freedom of the aristocracy, as long as they could prevent, for example, a king to rise, which is what happens when naturally a superior authority is needed when they settled on Roman land to administer. But aside from the aristocracy, all the rest of the people were under them by a degree, and or living in some kind of misery out there with autonomous clans literally having to provide for their own subsistence out there in surely in places that didn't offer more than much. So as I was saying before, it's a wholly unromantic picture of most things we have, or at least we would like to pretend to have happened at that point. The rendering of a service in labor by the poor, as opposed to paying a tax in money or in kind, sounds more stereotypically medieval than ancient. However, we find this, again, evidence since very early times, as far back as the late Republic. Poor agricultural technique, heavy taxation, requisitioning by the military, right? The depletion of nutrients in the soil after centuries of use and misuse. When you have latifundia, you don't need to invest more. You're going to be the one in charge, right? And so the situation would stagnate. Of course, just the ancient world had a very limited potential technologically in the exploitation of resources. So this was kind of a normal situation. When crisis arrives, naturally, whichever factor that has contributed to bog down the machine naturally increases, escalates. And this brought naturally also to a lot of land being abandoned, either because the occupants moved or they were killed. Think about the plague, right? So this brought naturally also to general infrastructural decay, because nature retook so many areas. The Roman roads were not upkept like before. The same. Just think about, for example, the shrinking in urban population, and the fact that, I don't know, aqueducts were something very impressive, but sometimes it became easier just to move the population closer to the riverbanks within the city than still paying for having aqueducts work, because that would have been too costly. So such things definitely really happened. Now, in all this misery that we pictured, however, as I was saying before, you don't have to think that there was ever a collapse of the system, right? We like to depict things that crash, that make noise, that everything collapses. It's the fall. There was none of this, right? This was just a normal, sorry state of the world, and there was nor a decline nor a fall, right? Agricultural production is cyclical. Resources are somehow reproducing, and people are going to exploit just the areas that are more convenient to them. And by a degree, surely there was, at some point, with the collapse of the Roman permanent military, for example, or tax system, an increase in, for example, some rural output somewhere, right? It's likely, again, this sounds too, we can't quite track this historically, but in general, at least the local communities were more aware of the balance that they could manage to locally survive, as opposed to, again, essentially a foreign government that simply says, okay, I need, let's say now, I don't know, the mob in Constantinople is unhappy. I will ransack an entire province, and who the hell cares about the people who live there? I will maintain the empire like that. This was typical, and just this is also, however, one of the reasons why some provinces at some point went on their own, and or accepted some other foreign rule to the imperial one, right? But more than else, you see, of course, that some of these communities were exposed to, for example, the invasions the settlement of the federati through the so-called hospitalities, so receiving 1/3 of the working land, not necessarily just to settle, but just to get the annona from, because that's also what the hospitalities happens. You don't have to think that they calculated 1/3 of the extent of the arable land, and they placed, Germans there. The occupation was, and the settlement was much more spontaneous than you think. But legally, those federati were entitled to the control of a province, right? So that's how a province that kept having her own Roman aristocracy, that kept having her own Roman administration and Roman peasantry, and so this now with a significant amount of Germanic warriors that were at the command of their leaders, and that de facto were in imperial control of the land, so that again there was a civilian administration more or less remained unchanged, and then literally someone provided with an imperium that commanded the local army that also gradually merged with the rest of the population, and to make that people locally, that polity, that and still that again agricultural military system, right, that autonomized itself in the process. Speaking of cities, right, we too find here that much of the medieval character was present, right? Although the number and the size of the cities declined from the late Roman Empire to the early Middle Ages, even in the city's heyday, let's say, living conditions weren't actually that splendid, right? Again, Roman civilization left us with some masterpieces of artistic production, of frescoes, also revealing us a lot about their daily life. We see very advanced quality of life buildings, infrastructures, and more, right? But again, this is still a pre-industrial world. Most people live in an appalling misery everywhere, right? There isn't a place in the world where people are rich, are well off, are happy, are healthy. We know what pre-industrial societies are like, and these ones in Rome are just the best life quality you could have at the time, but it's still miserable, right? You can imagine also the rest of the world in many ways, and that you would hopefully not want to imagine, as a matter of fact, but just know that that was real, right? Again, there was nothing even romantic or more or healthier or more splendid about living in a forest, right? It was a nightmarish experience, a traumatic one. It was an incredibly short and brutal experience of existence, and again, the same reason why the migration era happened the same way, because who was, say, at the frontier of the empire wanted to come living in the more populated areas because they were richer, they had greater surplus, they had greater stability, and fundamentally they got that, and they contributed, as we were saying before, just to maintain the same preeminence of those countries for a good millennium, and still continuous civilizational standards, top civilizational standards to this day. So the legacy of Rome here is the legacy of, again, a system that would remain, however, more or less how it had always been, right? Without a dramatic change or decline or shrinking or contraction or whatever. Yes, individual histories can be dramatic, but the essentials of the system were still and always there. Say in ancient Rome herself, for example, most streets were not paved. This is kind of obvious. it's rare to have paved roads. Even again in medieval times, just from the late Middle Ages, you start having something consistent. And again, especially in places, I don't know, like Florence, but very urbanized areas, of course. With also paved roads can be made in different ways. That paved roads existed technically before Rome, as you know, even among somewhat primitive people. That this doesn't mean that naturally that could remotely even compare with what the Roman road system would become. But generally speaking, again, roads, cities, or at least some centers of sort, exist in their functionality. And what's even the point of having everything paved, right? Just think about the sheer cost of the whole thing. Also, the width of the roads was not enormous, right? In the city center of Rome, only the Via Sacra and the Via Nova, so the Holy and the New Road specifically, were wide enough for 2 carts to pass. This, again, was just the normal consequence of how cities were built at the time. There wasn't such a huge traffic to render it kind of necessary to this kind of, say, kind of higher mobility, another type of topographical planning or whatever. It simply worked that way, and it was fundamentally going on from centuries now in the same city, the same capital of the empire. The Romans had aqueducts, and this helped dramatically, of course, urban health, the possibility of just drawing large amounts of water from the nearby sources, the bathing, things like that. But a very few houses had running water themselves, right? Fewer still in a connection to the sewers, which were a marvel, but definitely did not cover the majority of the dwellings. And this again was obvious because just life had completely different hygienic sanitary standards from today. For example, the public latrines that sometimes are mentioned even in proverbs regarding, for example, the fact that the monitor was made out of that, like today, by the way, were not actually used by everyone, right? The poor couldn't. It's just the rich that could afford that or were allowed properly to use them. And this tells you how the world really worked at the time. I mean, the powerful was naturally involved in politics, in representation, in institutions. He could have more, higher power just for a greater access to the greater services at the time. The streets were dirty, crowded, noisy, unlit, very dangerous, right? The rich, in order to go into them, had to be guarded, right, by private bodyguards, fundamentally. Just think about the problems of the identification of the ancient world, and or just the lower kind of speed of communication, their certainty, the capacity of storing them. Everything was much more entrusted to the mob, to this kind of private connections, etc. Most people lived in this crowded, stuffy, multi-story apartment blocks called insulae. At this time, they still existed. However, the Roman city was not as crowded as the medieval one would become. So, at this point, there were also simply less people, so there was less need to simply build like crazy, like this skyscrapers de facto, like they had existed in the early empire, the late republic. As the population increased, there was more surfacial place to exploit. Right. Consider that ancient people lived normally very much outside. Right. They went home just to sleep practically. Furniture was quite Spartan. There was just maybe a table, benches, a pallet for sleeping. Right. Cooking and heating were done with charcoal. And let's say even emptying the houses from rubbish, etc., was just very unsophisticated in many ways, and this contributed to the same lowering of hygienic standards. Again, just the minority of the population of the empire lived in the cities. And the reason why these people lived there naturally was varied, but of course had to do with the broader statal system that required some skilled personnel, some kind of public education, right? So all things that could be obtained more easily in the city. Medieval towns were generally small, right? And they were built within walls for protection. However, many centers in late antiquity were pretty similar to this, right? At least towns were shrinking, building walls around them. Consider that our understanding also of the actual demic distribution, the various settlements, whatever, is not so clear, right? There were cities, entire cities, that we discovered just recently having existed in the midst of, the most developed provinces of the empire. And many of them survived throughout the early Middle Ages, and again, without us knowing. And there is basically an entire world to discover yet. And this is quite famous. I mean, just think about what could be, like, simply modern countries today do not have the economical resources for carrying out major excavations all around, right? Just if I don't know how much it would cost for a country like Italy, for example, to just undig virtually all what exists, also relevant archaeological finds, and it would be just like an open-air excavation rather than a country. Of course, the cultural legacy output would be unspeakable, but it costs a lot of money, and this is valid for any other country in practice. And unfortunately, also the way archaeology works is connected with this, because say it's more convenient to dig for finding early imperial stuff, but a bit less for late antiquity or even the early modern age, and especially in the Mediterranean. Actually, the latter two periods are moments of continuous building in many ways that simply also from abroad does not receive much support, because hey, everybody wants the classical stuff. They don't care about early medieval structures, and this is a severe problem. There are a lot of criminals involved in these activities, meaning that, I don't know, but even from very respectable institutions, archaeologists arrive there, they search for classical stuff, they find, I don't know, an early medieval wall. By law, you cannot destroy, you cannot touch it, you should stop the entire excavation. If you find that, what do? They take it away, they destroy it, then they don't even write that there was. And these are, archaeologists, real ones, right? Eventually those that go on publishing and pretend to be, people. These people, I would shoot them on the spot, frankly, because I think that's the only just thing to do in front of these cases. Let's be honest, cultural legacy is much more important than people's lives, and it's useless to fool ourselves about that. In any case, as I was saying before, the point is that there were so many smaller centers that we have no idea of. Many late antique cities had walled areas of between 10 and 20 hectares, which probably means they didn't host at the time more than 5,000 people, right? So naturally, the way the population was distributed was also varying, and it was varying within the same greater cities. As I was saying before, great areas of the largest centers were going depopulated, even covered in forests within the same city walls. Population was moving from some areas to others, right? Other uphill or downhill, depending on the circumstances. Some flowing towards the rivers, others needing to fortify themselves from invaders. However, let's say that the great cities of the East, the city of Rome and a few others in the West, remained in good physical condition after all, right? Most of the others instead were to decline significantly, right? The largest cities of the empire were definitely in the East, but they weren't actually so densely present, concentrated geographically in like the Western, especially like in Italy, right? Cities like Verona or Ravenna or Rome were somehow close, Milan too, etc. In the East, they were more scattered. Constantinople was slightly larger than Rome, surfacially. And when you actually look at Justinian's reconquest, you realize that basically those are the borders of also the western areas that were probably more Roman, more late antique, let's say, in political and social mechanism, right? So it is fair to say that aside from Italy, southern Gaul, southern Spain, urban centers tended to decline in a much more pronounced way, right? Rome would remain the largest city in the West for half of a millennium, for not talking about her political, spiritual, and kind of cultural legacy. And we've seen this again in the video the other day about the Ostrogothic sieges. And generally speaking, you can sense there, even in spite of the destructions of the 6th century, etc., how much the system was much more deeply ingrained in a kind of urban fabric, right? And say in the historical region series, we have seen that I made some videos about the Italian city-states starting from late antiquity for medieval history, and you obviously see that even the later municipal development, the persistence of a city aristocracy that probably was municipally identified, it was proud, it was, self-glorifying itself, derives from the system of honors of late antiquity, of the ancient world, and basically it never ended. It was never a time which this thing say, well, it went depopulated, or it was a time which the system had to recreate itself. There is a direct, continuous flow that never dies, and actually remains at the center of the region's politics and control. And this went on. It's not just because of the church, it's literally because of a lay aristocracy that always has a great weight in all the political institutional events. We've seen it even in Carolingian times. In fact, during the same kind of foreign dominations that at the end of the day were just, again, based on the support of the local communities rather than else. And this went on uninterruptedly. There is not a break. There is not a moment of terrible fall or collapse or whatever. Right? This is incredibly important because, again, the dramatization of the period brings you to think that. And especially if you take a broader standard, say, I don't know, what happened in Britain, for example, to the cities, well, it's obvious that that area was kind of one of the least, let's say, continuous in urban life and etc. But there isn't just that, right? It was somehow a peripheral area, also a contained population, less level of development, etc. A great part of the world, mostly the center of what had been the West in the most Romanized areas, went on throughout all the migrations, the invasions, the settlements, whatever, just essentially as it had been, right? In fact, urban building never stopped, right? What happened, rather, is that starting from the 4th century, private benefaction of public buildings went down, right? Except for churches that were ever more endowed, and the reason being that the churches now were simply taking the place of the previous lay aristocracy, in part because they were the same people becoming bishops, in part because some aristocrats would abandon the city for the countryside, and or just there were other dynamics. There were moments in which the aristocracy of a certain area moved, like, for example, when the Roman army withdrew from Britain, lots of aristocrats left for Gaul. In the 6th century, during the Gothic War, a lot of Romano-Italic aristocracy fled to Constantinople. So you have these mechanisms, but we're talking very often about the top people, right? So probably those who had naturally and hierarchically be more munificent. So that had basically the Roman cities were not so different from the medieval ones, in as much as there were some guilds basically that provided with the resources for the constructions, the infrastructures, the games, and so on. And mostly these were held by local aristocrats that initially, as governors, were pretty unitary in the way they, say, exclusive in the way they would rule these centers. By early medieval times, you have more clans ruling the city sometimes, and so this would be typical because they already existed technically, but again, you take away that super state that existed before, you have just this local aristocracy that is also more composed, right? So the same city of Rome, we've seen it very often in its also playlist. It's plenty of that information about the struggles of the Roman aristocracy. It was always somehow up to something in this international game because they exploited this dominations, the papacy, to just maintain their own prerogatives, their own status, their international recognition. They were the ones that would elect emperors still, traditionally. That was already a thing in Roman times. The same goes for the influence on the papacy. So you can understand the degree of power. In any case, still in late antiquity, of course, the imperial government and its provincial governors continued to provide for the construction of impressive buildings, right? Just in the 4th, in the 5th centuries, these constructions tended to concentrate in the imperial capitals or favored places of the emperors, right? So, say, Trier, Milan, Naissus, Nicomedia, then, of course, Constantinople, but Rome always remained at the center of that. There are so many buildings that date, at least in their foundation, to those times, and again, the capital of the empire, bear in mind, never lost the title of capital. You could have administrative capitals, but Rome was the only possibly recognized capital of the empire. Even when the emperors were in Ravenna or in Milan, or then of course there is an itinerancy as well that, as we have seen, is ever more necessary as the system falls apart to maintain the allegiance of the various provinces. And this is also what resembles very much the medieval practice of the itinerating court and so on. So you had the comitatus at this point, etc. However, as the case of Constantinople definitely shows, you have also massive, well, it's a bit of an exception in absolute terms, because Constantinople would gradually overshadow any other city in the Eastern Roman Empire, but there is still in late antiquity a very fixed implantation of permanent, massive, urban infrastructural centers, right? And this thing basically doesn't die as long as late antiquity is there until the 7th century. Also in the East, you don't have a significant decay of that formula, right? That is essentially also an Hellenistic one, right? In the East, and you have, of course, cities that, differently from the West, by far predate the same Roman Empire. Just think about this; it's very important. I mean, the basically, aside from the Hellenic and Punic colonies on the Mediterranean, the entire hinterland of the Western Roman Empire owes its urbanization to Rome, right? There were proto-urban centers, think about the Celtic Oppida and so on, but let's say every single city, civitas, right? Also what remains in the districtuation of the post-Roman countries and so on. It's a Roman foundation, plus it's the center of the local diocese. So there is, even in this, a very different, but still, let's say, system from the East, but paradoxically a more unitary one. If you wonder again, even the success of the church in the West, in the absence of an empire, well, this stems largely from the fact that not just the church, like in the East, by the way, the diocese was present in the city, right? But that city had been founded by Rome, by the divine empire that had represented the Golden Age. So there was an aura of sacredness, because you know that whenever the Romans founded a city, it was an identical copy of Rome, provided, maybe even just in a mini scale. You find still some centers, I don't know, in Algeria that were just pretty modest, located in some rocky place, whatever, but it had the temple to Jupiter, it had the forum, it had all was like, had to be like Rome. There was a sense of transfiguration or redemption in this, and in the fact that this world had been part and was still part of the empire even after the West had gone. That the West owes, in my opinion, most of its success, aside from all the kind of strange materialistic, deterministic, environmentalistic explanations that our atheistic historiography wants to pretend to be the case. We underestimate this major factor. Western urbanization is Roman urbanization. And as I said before, in the eras in which Europe was historically, culturally, climatically divided, this was a massive watershed, right? Just think about the most important cities of the Middle Ages, which one they are. Paris, London, Cologne, Lyon, you named them. Regensburg, Vienna. I'm not talking about southern France or Italy or Spain, because there but I'm just naming a few, but even in those northern provinces, actually, you have mostly the most important urban centers dating to that time. Naturally, in the wake of the crisis, the most important infrastructures in the cities at this point were the things like town walls, palaces, aqueducts, right? Sometimes baths continued to be repaired or built again. Other structures, however, tended to decay or not to be built ex novo, because in part they already existed. So just literally the Colosseum, the the arenas of Arles or of Verona, etc., still stand, right? So the Romans built for eternity, and just the structures were there. The material, right? The stones, like these were kept being used in the south much more than elsewhere, because they just were there, but that's also where wealth had been historically concentrated. The arenas weren't quite just also needed anymore for gladiatorial games, because Christianity forbid them. There were races in the circuses, things like these, and this life again went on for a very long time. With late antiquity, the early modern age, the early Middle Ages, keep saying this. We don't have so many sources telling us what everyday life was really like, but we know from scattered evidence that, of course, like, I don't know, when the Longobards settled in Milan, they kept, making the races go, and the Longobard kings would just assist to them like Roman emperors, right? And this is not something you see in pop culture, you hear of it, whatever, but like for them, like in at the end of the 6th, the beginning of the 7th century was completely normal. And why not? I mean, Milan kept being that city and kept functioning that way, so why not, right? Especially at that point where, together with Pavia, had become one of the most important cities of a stable polity. So this is to say that aside from what the sources tell us, or what we dig or don't dig most of the times, there is an entire world that went on, and that we forgot literally to document, because, or to search for, or to think about. And this is a huge cultural problem. The fact that we haven't pictured the fact that these times existed. But in general, there is a decline of infrastructure, of monuments. Probably there aren't resources to just build them again. You see, most of what we see of today's monuments dating from those times, of course, they mostly date to the early empire. Why? Because they could concentrate way more resources in a single place, right? It's not that these massive infrastructures like the Pont du Gard, the Colosseum, or whatever, just popped out like mushrooms from the local resources. There was a massive empire that could carry out, like, I don't know, the construction of, I don't know, the Canal of Corinth, or, bridging. It had massive engineering capacities, enormous resources. No empire had ever been so rich, right? So in some places where you see that wealth concentrated, you can say, wow, this thing still stands, right? But as you know, the Romans were somehow civilized technologically by the Greeks, and from ancient Greece that was already that technologically advanced, we don't have that much comparatively, because they didn't have an empire of the size of Rome for such a long time. And so, yes, they had the knowledge, they lived in splendid places, but not so much has survived, because it's normal that after 2,000 years, most of that would unfortunately be gone. And instead, for Rome, we have this incredibly sturdy, massive, kind of probably pragmatically obsessed construction building that was meant to resist the test of the millennia, because again, Rome was technically to remain forever as the center of the world, and the order that it had given to it had to remain unchanged, right? And this massive infrastructures were just the proof of that. So that we are really, then today we do not make a history of how much, like, I don't know, the world in the medieval or modern times didn't have some things that the Romans had. Like Paris was not so well served by sewers until, say, Napoleon's time, the 19th century, right? It's not before the 20th century that Italians could bring as much water in the city of Rome as much as the ancient Romans did. Naturally, this doesn't mean that those worlds were less developed than Rome. They were different, right? And they were already dramatically more advanced. And most of these advancements had been achieved already by medieval times. So bear in mind, yes, that there are differences, and that not necessarily one element of advancement corresponds to a generalized level of advancement, right? So don't be necessarily overly comparative, because that is also to be really contextualized. As we were saying before, medieval cities had, for example, a much greater demic concentration than the Roman ones. They were much more they also reflected in this sense the also more modest output overall that the empire had compared to, say, late medieval Europe as such, right? So different times, different developments. Humans just develop in different ways, right? Not because there are some strange given factors, but because people think differently and act differently. They need to do different things. It's mostly a political problem rather than any environmental materialistic explanation, right? So naturally, Roman infrastructures, as you know, helped overbearingly the development of Western civilization during the Middle Ages and beyond. So everybody was aware throughout all the following millennia at this point, that Rome had again achieved the golden age, had made the deal. Everybody resumed only the Roman name, imperially speaking, to rule afterwards. Today we have been again removed these ideas by radical moral subjectivism, dogmatic materialism, anti-religious phobia and hatred. So naturally, for most people, it's become de facto impossible even to embrace these ideas anymore, because they lack the civilizational, moral, and human tools to properly to handle them, to accept them for what they have become. Now, naturally, from an individual point of view, but it can't be seen. History can't be seen otherwise. The importance, of course, as we've seen, is the change also in the moral spirit, the necessity for coming back to a spiritual unity, which is often understood as a sort of cultural decline, but actually was an incredibly important foundation for the maintenance of the aforementioned collective unity in front of a political fragmentation, which the West achieved, because it was to rise anyhow, as opposed to the East. In the late Roman Empire, we definitely see this in this change in sculpture, in decorative arts that tend to grow closer unavoidably to medieval art as we have come to know it. But again, it's part of a unitary process. Christian subjects became, of course, more common, especially in the cities where they, spread the earliest and brought, in this sense, like to the broader controls of the countryside, and even secularly themed works became more transcendental and symbolic as a consequence. Objectively, the Roman Empire had, at that point, as we were talking about the other day, grown some ideas that were, at least among the masses, that were kind of deterministic, Dionysian, Orphic, that were against anything that the celestial order of the empire had been founded like. Even some Christians properly didn't understand the difference. We have seen it with Sidonius of Cyrene, that literally believed in metempsychosis and in the eternal the eternity of the world, and the Christians demanded him naturally to abandon these ideas, which are incredibly superstitious and opposite to any concept on the basis of which Romanity, the Romanity of the empire, had been founded also in non-Christian times. So actually this helped a lot Saint West to preserve itself over the centuries in spite of the slowness of the Latin Germanic development in the immediate centuries. But it was a tough time for everyone, and the most properly Eastern influenced provinces, as you know, were lost to the Muslims. So that even the Byzantine world in its kind of Hellenic character actually held on after all, in spite of some mechanism that prevented it from adapting on the longer run especially to the expensive capacity that other surrounding cultures had acquired, especially the Western one proper, narrowly meant. So the idea of, for example, zoomorphic or kind of properly of natural scientific detail that to us we say, oh my god, how beautiful that art is, of course, was looking towards perfection, etc. But in this sense, it had also degenerated in a multiplicity of spirits, of forces that the masses, that as we've seen, had been broken morally over time, as they had been asked originally by the empire to maintain their standard also through the citizenship, were feeling under. Right? Rome had managed to invert this dynamic for an incredibly long time, while the world had already been degenerating along that pattern, and now these things had been taken over again. So the return in Christian times to more conceptual sculpture and painting, right, and kind of breaking with at least not properly the classical rules, but especially the Hellenistic ones, right, the ones of the last phase of the cycle of the fall properly of the Hellenic civilization, at least meant in a classical sense, in fact, had achieved, right, and there are some actual hints at some evidence actually to the, of course, more interiorized, but also kind of more divine connected ideas that art really meant. The gold, for example, the purple is coming back. There is the need, the feeling properly, also the pathos by a degree, as far as it could be channeled in a surpassing of the same, in an improvement that is expressed by the new order, right? The future definitely seemed less and less promising. So people said, "Why, this system collapsed." Well, it's the fault of those who, not of the elites. It's the fault of the people. The elites took over, right? And actually managed, as we've seen, to pull it off. After all, even throughout the centuries, even though we think this world collapsed, but still. Again, this is a very modernistic view of it. The Romanity of the empire survived until the 19th century. So you're usually not told history like this, but that's what they actually believed at the time until the 19th century. In spite, of course, of the emergence of other thoughts and ideas, naturally, we don't know, as I was saying before, all that, a 6th century, Spanish peasant believed. But generally speaking, it mattered relatively in front of the taking over the Romano-Germanic elites of the church. And these are the ones that made the deal after, right, till to this day, at least before we decided to forget about them. So, in a sense, Roman thoughts withdrew from the here and now, because naturally it was depressing and it was a greater anxiety about how do we make it in the future, right? And this was responded artistically to by presenting even secular heroes as having contact with the beyond, right? So recovering that connection which had been lost in terms of the transcendental bond that also artistically had been surpassed in favor of fundamentally just of an aesthetics, right? And also an ever milder kind of Pelagian sensual one, rather than, one thinking about the order, right, of the universe. And naturally, the problem that this new course of events, politically speaking, with the shrinking of the empire, had meant, because it meant that humanity had failed, because Rome was the empire of mankind, right? The empire in which also Christ had been born. Today we haven't discussed about Christianity further, but we will do it naturally in other videos. And all these aspects contributed to mold that world that we know, in fact, not just because of a material, deterministic process, but consistently because of the forma mentis, as the Latins would have said, right? So something that translated itself in matter from a spiritual dimension. And for this, naturally, we will have to make lots of other videos to explain properly. That's it. For today, we will naturally keep talking about this. I wish you a happy Easter, by the way. In the meanwhile, I just hope that you enjoyed this video for today. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you, as always, heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.